Hello, my name is Zane Price. I'm here with my English-only partner, Alexis DeMartino, against the side of bilingual education, Sebastian Andrade and Cecelia Kovatch. Our debate format for today is going to involve opening statements from both sides, followed by cross-examination, and then we will close out with some brief closing statements. I'm going to begin with my partner on the right, Alexis DeMartino, who is in favor of English-only education. Alexis, you have 2 to 3 minutes for your opening statement.
All right. So, utilizing English-only education reduces spending on second language instructors. This means that the funding can be put towards new programs or better equipment in the classroom that benefits all students and staff. Now, this is important because you want to have the best equipment for your students to use, the best technology for them to utilize, and you also want your staff to be able to use anything that they need in order to get their point across in all their lessons. And the funding is very important in the schools because you only have so much, especially with many public schools all over the world.
You can't understate the funding aspect of English-only education.
Absolutely. And English only promotes unity also. It allows students to remain on the same track, which also reduces the achievement gap when it comes to language and proficiency. When students are divided by a language, they seem to fall behind depending on which language they're studying closely to. With English only, they're all on the same track, they're following the same language, the same curriculum, the same standards, and it makes it easy for them to stay on the same goals and to proceed as they would normally. Now, with English education only, it also allows for the teacher working in English with all the students to engage with the students on an equitable level with more time to focus on specific aspects of one curriculum rather than expanding their scope to account for multiple languages. This allows the teacher to connect directly with all the students because they're all on the same wavelength, they're all speaking the same language, and she doesn't have to worry about having maybe a co-educator in the room in order to access the same materials and language that the other students in the classroom may need. And he or she doesn't have to worry about meeting with the student one-on-one if there's some struggles there and worrying about maybe they don't understand what they're trying to say or what the problem is in their instruction or what goals they need to meet.
And at the heart of it, English-only education is about unity, the coalescence of teacher and students, regardless and empowered by those students' backgrounds around one language, and that is English. We now turn to the bilingual education opening statements. We now turn to Sebastian and Cecelia Kovatch. Please begin.
When it comes to deciding how English language learners should be integrated into classrooms, we believe that bilingual education is the only way to go because bilingual education puts a heavy emphasis on focusing on the student as a whole. We're not just focused on their education in the English language, we're focused on how they are socially, emotionally, and operating within the classroom. When it comes to bilingual education, it supports their native language, which does more culturally supporting their background, what they grew up learning. This is very important for these students because it allows them to value where they came from while learning about where they are. And this supports them emotionally. This brings them to a well-rounded individual who, in the future, long-term, are more marketable on a job application. You know multiple languages. You were not forced to just learn one and forget wherever you came from.
So as Cecelia said, bilingual education supports the student's native language, which has been researched and proven that lowers the affective filter, making it crucial for students to feel safe within a classroom and promotes learning. That is in effect the goal for a teacher. So teachers in a
We won't have any crosstalk during the opening statements, if that's okay. So we return to Sebastian.
Perfect, thank you. So bilingual education promotes the cultural diversity and inclusivity in the classroom by lowering that affective filter. But also the long-term benefits are that bilingualism is a valuable skill. We see how important it is in our global economy and how bilingual graduates are often more competitive in the job market. This just demonstrates how beneficial bilingual education is in classroom education, but also in real-world application, providing future student success and promoting the conversation of bilingual education outside of the classroom and into society.
Well, that's that. We're now move into the hotly contested cross-examination section, now seen as the English only were the first to go in their opening statements. It's only befitting that the bilingual cohort can ask the English only section questions first. You will have 4 to 5 minutes for this section, and your time begins now.
Again, focusing on the students as a whole, as we appreciate and value in our understanding of how these students should be educated, we would like to ask you what measures are in place to ensure that bilingual programs do not segregate or isolate students from their peers.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
I put mine into the wrong one.
Yeah,
Wait, hold on.
we're gonna take a brief sabbatical as bilingual
Would you like me to restate the question?
enthusiasts so often
Yes,
do.
please.
They self-destructed right there, and they debased their own feelings.
How will you in your English only classroom make sure your students feel supported and not isolated or left out from their mainstream culture that you are pushing on them?
Well, it's all about unity. We want them to all be connected at the same point. We want them to all learn the same language. So if they are speaking another language, it's not like we'll completely cut that out and not let them speak it in their native language in the classroom, but we are prioritize their learning in the same language so they stay on track with their other classmates, because that could even make other students around them feel isolated when they're speaking a separate language with their friends. We want them all to be in the same track and on the same language so they stay together rather than
And
separate.
frankly,
Mm.
it's a little churlish to pigeonhole one's culture
Mhm.
specifically to their language. And so just because we're bringing them this sense of unity by teaching English and what you may say neglecting their other language,
Mhm.
this doesn't mean that we're stymieing their cultural background as a whole. As us English people know, there are multiple culturally diverse books written in English that tell of the backgrounds of various cultures with various language backgrounds. So I'm not assassinating your character here, but frankly, I think it's a little naive of you to even ask that question.
I'm glad you brought that up because I would counter by asking you, these students in your classroom who grew up in the country that you're in, learning the language that they learn, right? Here in America, we're speaking English in this classroom, you're pushing English only. They grew up in this culture and they grew up with these friends, they understand the language, the slang. These students are coming in with a different culture, a different set of social skills and social parameters that they understand and believe to fall under. They're set back. They're at a disadvantage than these other kids. How are you going to account for that gap?
Well, what I would say to that is them bringing their own valued and wonderful language and culture into America, into English only society. Do you wish for them merely to stay inside that cohort that has come along with them? Or would you rather, in the English only model, integrate them into this wider language system that we have so they can build bonds while still holding on to that sense of community that they have with their own culture, but being able to express that culture through English? And as Alexis had mentioned, the proficiency models demonstrate that that's the way, the English only method is what's going to allow you to get to that integration with their peers faster than the bilingual model.
I think it's also important to note that we're not setting them up for failure. We're setting them up for success in all the subjects that they need to know in order to thrive in the society, and also to get a job and any other situation that they might need to be in. Now, that being said, of course, we're not asking them to forget everything they learned from their family or their culture and all the language that they've learned. We want them to keep that, but we also want them to add on and learn this core language that everyone else, like most of the society, speaks, right, at the moment. And there are still going to be language courses. It's not English only for every single subject in the school. It would probably be arithmetic, English, writing, science, and history. But there's still going to be second language courses like French, Italian, Spanish, stuff like that. So it's not completely excluding them, but their main courses, we want them to be set up successfully for when they go into the workforce or anything that they may desire when they get older.
You have time for one more brief question on the cross examination.
So I'm glad you brought up the point of unity and kind of creating an inclusive classroom, just because we know that the effective filter is created when the student feels unsafe or unaccepted in a classroom. And as we've seen, as research suggests, it could last up to 6 months that the effective filter is high and the student doesn't want to participate. And although they are grasping the information, they're missing out on critical social skills, social development skills, and just understanding. So how would you suggest that the English only method would counteract that high effective filter while also not specializing on that student or creating specific strategies for that student?
Well, if you think about it, the English only program promotes consistent English proficiency. Like, we're training you over and over, and by doing that, we're reducing the anxiety, we're reducing the fear that they may feel when coming into something that they've never experienced before. And I think that would in turn lower the effective filter because they're less anxious, less scared of what's to come, and they kind of have that consistency that this is what it's going to be, and they know what to expect, because that's a big thing in students, especially when they're younger, is routine. Knowing what's going to come reduces that effective filter.
And I'll begin my answer with a concession that if a student who comes from a background of no English is immediately immersed into English only education without respecting the silent period, that could highly affect the effective filter. That's why we promote with English only education the respecting of that silent period early on for them to start to create the brain synapses that associate with English only education, so that when their time to integrate and talk in the class comes, that effective filter remains steady, and so that their learning can prosper. Okay, we will now move on to the cross-examination of bilingual education by the English-only cohort. Our time begins now, and I'll have Alexis start with the first question.
I wanted to mention that you're prioritizing bilingual education. That would mean two. Now, what about trilingual education or quadlingual education? What about the various dialects that find themselves within the country and all over the world? How would you target those if you're just focusing on 2 different languages, and what would those 2 languages even be?
So I just feel like, as we've learned, bilingual education doesn't specify on the language so much as it specifies on the strategies to promote the language function or a language understanding. So it's much less on focusing on Spanish education into English. It's more of just what are the strategies that best promote learning from one language to another while socially being conformed into the classroom. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And while I can respect your answer, Sebastian, optically, you have to look at it and sense if you have to have a teacher in the classroom who's privy to the nuances of Mandarin and Spanish and French and any of the other languages that are coming into a great city like Scranton right now and really emboldening the culture. How do you see that affecting the cost of education in the classroom if you need so many tools for so many specific languages, not even to mention having an actual teacher who can work with the different languages in a level that's respectful and coherent to your bilingual, your ELL student?
We believe that education is not about money. We're not cutting costs to get our point across faster. It's more important to us that our students are being supported again in any way we possibly can. We see education as you're there every day. Your kids are there from 6 hours a day, longer with sports. They deserve to have the support that they need academically, emotionally, socially. If they have a person in the classroom who understands their language, who understands their culture in a way that I can as a teacher, because I grew up only here, then they have that extra level of support. To us, that safety and that support to the student, we can't put a price on it. If you can, you can.
Especially with the politics of ELL, we've noticed that over many, many years that it does revolve around money, and money is a big problem in schools because not many schools don't have enough, or they use it for the wrong reasons. Especially in a situation like this, if you do prioritize bilingual education, you have these high-paid, well-respected teachers that do all these languages, because of course they're going to want more compensation for all the things that they can do compared to a normal teacher. And all the technology you may need, like maybe an earpiece to translate languages or translating machines and stuff like that. What are you going to cut funding from in order to do that? Because you only have a certain budget, especially in public schools.
Right, that's an excellent point. And I think the main idea that I want to bring up is that as of right now, I feel like ELL education is seen as kind of an extracurricular, but we need to bring it back towards comparing it to disability education. Disability education is kind of a pillar in the education community of how it's to represent all students. Same thing with bilingual education. We're seeing an increase of students with bilingual skills, and as we spoke before, one in 4 students will have bilingual education needs. So I think it's less about adding funding and more prioritizing it as a pillar of education model.
We have one final time for one final question, and I'll posit it in the form of a scenario. Picture me a second generation Slovakian American English language learner. I'm in your classroom, and I'm working in the bilingual system, translating between Slovakian and English, and a lot of my time seems to be individualized or grouped rather than as part of the general education classroom. Tell me, how am I not supposed to feel isolated, or in terms perhaps stronger than the sentiment of this scenario, segregated from the rest of my classroom?
I think that would be, it's up to the teacher to make sure that these students don't feel this way. When you're incorporating it correctly, you're creating an environment of inclusion and understanding. Your students are now around a person who might not look like them or speak like them or think like them. And if you promote that is a good thing, that is a positive thing, that it's important to see people who aren't like you and who don't think like you, and to respect their understandings and their languages, these students do have to work a little bit harder. That's just where they are at. Studies show that these students tend to outperform their peers who are speaking only one language. Studies show that after a time, these students will be able to gain proficiency in both languages beyond what their students are already accomplishing at a rate that they have had faster. If done correctly, bilingual education turns a student into a well-rounded individual. Could you be done poorly and be segregated? Sure, but it's up to us to educate our teachers on how to properly manage these students.
And before closing arguments, just a reminder that fact checking for this video can be found at www.zaneprice.com. I mentioned that just on account of that last answer. I mean, we'll move on to closing arguments now. Now, given that the English only cohort began, we are going to give bilingual the opportunity to decide on whether they want to be the first closing argument or to have the last word of the debate.
I think you guys can go ahead, since you guys are naturally,
Superior.
Need a little more support. Just the scaffolding of the situation.
We will now begin it's 2 to 3 minutes?
I believe so, yes.
Apologies. We're gonna go 2 to 3 minutes on the closing arguments. We're gonna begin with the English only cohort, and that time begins now.
Right. Now, English only education is the only economically sound way to ensure our growing student population with diverse and wonderful backgrounds can achieve English as a lingua franca to grow the communities of the future.
And the lingua franca is, of course, that common collective social language that can be spoken about with people who may not even utilize English as their first language, but have it as an access point that they can discuss with people across the country.
Absolutely. And as I said before, English only programs immerse the students in a single language environment. This provides consistent exposure to the language and what they are to expect, what they are to learn, and what they are to know as they progress through all their curriculum. This consistency can reduce anxiety and confusion, and which are factors with the high effective filter, and this is in order to lower it. Another point is that English-only education promotes a common language and thus a common goal for students to coalesce around with offers ways to build connections among students. Like we said, our biggest point is unity.
And just a response, frankly, to the last answer of bilingual education, that's a lot of variables in that situation where you have to have a teacher who is able to accommodate the student in bilingual education. The teacher has to be good enough to make sure that that student is integrated within the rest of the general English speaking classroom. With English only education, that issue ceases to be, as you're now dealing with this cohesive unit that's all working towards the same goal, which is English education. And so I guess in my closing statement and our closing argument for English only is the consistency and the lack of the volatility inherent with the bilingual education model. And that finishes English only's closing statement. We will now finish our video with bilingual education's closing statement, and that begins now.
I would like to start by saying that bilingual education can be intimidating for some and hard to approach if you are, I wouldn't use the term less than, but not prepared to enter a little chaos in your classroom. You got
Teach like a pirate.
20 something students coming at you, going through puberty. Chaos is just what the classroom is. If you are prepared to walk in and support your student in any way you possibly can, I think that bilingual education is the way to go. We want to break down our closing statements into the benefits for cognitive development, cultural diversity and social inclusion, and looking at it at a long-term globalized scale. These students, as I said, are going to gain problem solving and critical thinking skills that wouldn't be shown in an English only classroom. They're going to outperform their peers and they're going to succeed in life. When you throw them onto a job market, they have 2 languages to fall back on. That's marketable. That's just the facts. I mean, you can't not look at that and expect doors to open for these students.
And just one thing that I wanted to add was, with all the figures that we could include, I felt that a personal experience would be highly impressive. Just as a student from bilingual education, I've noticed how useful it is and how it creates a community within your own classroom. I have made lifelong friends with students who never picked up the language, who never picked up the language and needed extra support, or who had success and moved out of the bilingual classroom into an all-inclusive classroom. The one thing I could say is, just from my own experiences, the goal for bilingual education isn't to provide a final solution for all the problems, but to provide a reasonable method, sort of like eloquentia perfecta, as our university promotes. It's providing the right approach for the right reasons. So you may be wrong at certain points, but you're approaching it with the right strategies.
And again, you can fact check whether Sebastian went through that bilingual experience at my website.
George Washington Elementary.
Thank you very much.
Give him the heater.
Goodbye.